I was 38 years old when I learned that loyalty is not something you lose all at once. It slips away quietly, like warmth leaving a room you thought was sealed from the cold. At that point in my life, I believed I understood who I was, a wife of 15 years, a woman who had built her identity around stability, patience, and compromise. I believed in endurance. I believed that love, if protected carefully enough, could survive anything. My life did not look dramatic from the outside. It was ordinary in the way many women's lives are after 35. Mornings began with routines I could perform without thinking. Coffee brewed at the same time every day. The house woke up slowly, as if even the walls were tired. I went to work, came home, cooked meals that tasted familiar, and filled silence with practical thoughts. I told myself this was peace. Somewhere along the way, passion had softened into habit. I noticed it, of course, but I did not fear it. I thought this was maturity. I thought this was what love became when it stopped trying to impress and started trying to last. My husband and I did not argue often. We did not shout. We did not break things. We simply existed next to each other, sharing responsibilities more than dreams. I ignored the quiet signs because they were easy to ignore. A distracted look, a phone turned slightly away from me, shorter answers, longer pauses. I told myself I was imagining things because imagination was safer than truth. After all, women my age are taught not to be dramatic, not to be needy, not to ask questions that might disturb the fragile balance of family life. The day I discovered the betrayal did not arrive with thunder. It came gently, almost politely, as if it did not want to alarm me. There was no confrontation, no explosive revelation. There was only a moment when a pattern no longer made sense and my mind refused to look away. I remember standing alone, holding information I never asked for but could not unsee. My body reacted before my thoughts did. My hands felt heavy. My chest tightened. It was as if my heart had stepped back, unsure whether it was safe to stay inside me. I did not cry immediately. Shock does not come with tears. It comes with silence. In that silence, memories rearranged themselves. Moments I had dismissed returned with sharper edges. Late nights explained themselves. Emotional distance revealed its true shape. I realized that the version of my marriage I had been protecting existed mostly in my loyalty, not in reality. Pain arrived later, after disbelief had done its work. It was not loud pain. It was deep and heavy, pressing down on me until breathing felt deliberate. I questioned everything, not just my marriage, but myself. I wondered how long I had been blind, and whether blindness was a choice I had made out of fear. I wondered if loving deeply meant accepting humiliation quietly. The hardest part was not anger, it was disappointment. I had trusted not only my husband, but the life we had built together. Betrayal felt like standing in a house whose foundation had cracked while I was busy decorating the walls. I did not know yet that forgiveness would become part of my story. At that moment, forgiveness felt impossible, even offensive. I felt reduced, as if my years of effort had been erased by someone else's selfishness. I felt older than my age, suddenly aware of time in a way that frightened me. Yet beneath the pain, something else stirred. A question I had never asked myself before began to form. It was not about him, it was about me. Who was I if this marriage no longer defined me? What did strength look like when endurance stopped being noble and started being harmful? I did not have answers. I only had the certainty that my life had split into before and after, and that whatever came next would demand more courage than I had ever been asked to show. That was the day everything broke.
and it was also the day something began.
After the truth settled into my bones, life did not stop. That was perhaps the cruelest part. The world continued with its routines, indifferent to the fact that my internal structure had collapsed. I still woke up every morning. I still went through the motions, but everything felt heavier, as if gravity had quietly increased and only I had noticed. Pain is often described as sharp, but mine was dull and persistent. It followed me through rooms, through days, through thoughts I could no longer control. I carried it in my body, in my shoulders that refused to relax, in my jaw that ached from clenching, in my sleep, which became shallow and unreliable. Nights were the worst. Silence gave my mind permission to replay everything I had missed, everything I had trusted, everything I had given without hesitation. I did not confront him immediately, not because I was weak, but because I needed time to understand what I was feeling. Anger rose and fell, but it was never clean. It was tangled with sadness, embarrassment, and a quiet grief for the woman I had been before this knowledge entered my life. That woman believed in certainty. She believed that loyalty was mutual simply because she offered it freely. I began to question my own memory. I revisited years of shared life, searching for cracks I had ignored. I wondered if love had been real at all, or if it had only existed in my commitment. This kind of doubt is corrosive. It does not attack loudly, it whispers, slowly dismantling trust not just in others, but in oneself. What hurt most was not the act of betrayal itself, but the realization that while I had been building a life around us, he had been living parts of his life outside of it. I felt foolish for having believed that effort alone could preserve intimacy. I felt exposed, as if my devotion had been displayed without consent. And yet, even in the depths of that pain, I did not feel hatred. That confused me. I expected rage. I expected a clear enemy. Instead, I felt an aching sadness that wrapped itself around everything. I mourned what we had been. I mourned what we would never be again. I mourned the illusion of safety I had relied on for so long. I also began to see myself differently. For years, I had defined strength as endurance. I had believed that being a good wife meant being patient, adaptable, forgiving even before forgiveness was requested. I had made myself smaller in subtle ways, prioritizing peace over honesty, stability over emotional risk. Betrayal forced me to confront the cost of that choice. I realized how often I had silenced my intuition, how many times I had dismissed discomfort because addressing it felt inconvenient. I had learned to ignore myself to maintain harmony, and now that harmony revealed itself as fragile and conditional. There was fear, too. Fear of starting over at my age, fear of being alone, fear of being judged. Society does not teach women over 35 to begin again. It teaches them to hold on, to compromise more, to accept less. I felt the weight of that expectation pressing on me, urging me to stay quiet, to endure gracefully. But something inside me resisted that narrative. Pain stripped away the parts of me that were trying to please. It exposed a deeper truth. I was tired of surviving quietly. I was tired of being strong in ways that required my silence. When I finally allowed myself to acknowledge the possibility of forgiveness, it did not come from a place of weakness. It came from exhaustion. Carrying resentment required energy I no longer had. But forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It did not mean excusing. It meant choosing not to let the betrayal define the rest of my life. I knew reconciliation, if it ever happened, would demand honesty I had never asked for before.
It would demand vulnerability from both of us, and I was not sure if he was capable of meeting me there. I wasn't even sure if I wanted him to. What I did know was that I needed to reclaim myself. Not the version of me that existed before the betrayal, but a stronger, clearer version shaped by truth rather than fear. Pain had taken something from me, but it had also given me clarity, and clarity, I was beginning to understand, is a form of power. This part of my life was not about resolution. It was about sitting with discomfort without rushing to fix it. It was about allowing grief to exist without apology. It was about learning that love, when it asks you to disappear, is not love worth preserving. I was still wounded, still uncertain, still standing at the edge of a decision I was not ready to make. But for the first time, I was listening to myself. And that changed everything.
Time has a strange way of reshaping pain. It does not erase it, but it dulls the sharpest edges, making room for reflection where chaos once lived. As days turned into weeks, I found myself existing in a space that felt both suspended and exposed. We were still under the same roof, still sharing a life on the surface, yet emotionally we were standing on opposite sides of a fracture neither of us knew how to cross. I observed him differently now. Without the filter of trust, small details became significant. I noticed hesitation where there had once been confidence. I noticed guilt expressed not through words, but through absence, through restraint, through a carefulness that felt unfamiliar. And in that observation, something unexpected happened. My anger softened into understanding, not understanding that excused, but understanding that explained. I began to see him not only as the man who betrayed me, but as a flawed human being who had failed to confront his own emptiness. This realization did not bring comfort, it brought complexity. It forced me to accept that betrayal rarely comes from cruelty alone. Often it grows in silence, in unspoken dissatisfaction, in emotional neglect that both people contribute to without realizing it. This insight was painful because it required me to look inward. I had to face my own role, not in his choice, but in the distance that had grown between us. I had assumed responsibility would be enough. I had replaced emotional presence with reliability. I had mistaken stability for intimacy. These realizations did not absolve him, but they reminded me that relationships decay long before they collapse. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a moment. It is a process that begins with the decision to understand rather than punish. And understanding required me to dismantle the narrative of victimhood I had unconsciously embraced. I was hurt, yes, betrayed undeniably, but I was also capable of growth, of agency, of choosing what came next. In the quiet moments, I confronted my fear of being alone. I imagined a future without him and felt both terror and relief. Terror at the unknown, relief at the possibility of rediscovering myself without compromise. This duality forced me to ask a question that frightened me more than betrayal itself. Did I want to forgive him because I loved him, or because I feared losing the life I knew? That question followed me everywhere. It lingered in my thoughts during routine tasks. It surfaced during sleepless nights. And slowly, painfully, I began to separate my identity from my marriage. I remembered who I was before I became someone's wife. I remembered ambitions I had postponed, desires I had minimized, a voice inside me that had grown quiet over the years. As I reclaimed that voice, forgiveness became less about him and more about me. I realized that holding on to resentment anchored me to the worst moment of my life.
letting go did not mean forgetting, it meant allowing myself to move forward without dragging the weight of betrayal behind me. The space between us became a mirror. It reflected not only what we had lost, but what we had never fully built. Emotional intimacy requires presence, curiosity, and courage. We had relied too heavily on time and shared history, assuming they would compensate for neglected connection. They did not. I allowed myself to imagine reconciliation not as a return to what was, but as the creation of something new, something honest, something vulnerable, something that acknowledged damage rather than pretending it never happened. That possibility did not guarantee happiness, but it offered authenticity. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt a sense of calm that did not depend on certainty. I accepted that I could survive either outcome. I could rebuild with him, or I could rebuild alone. My strength no longer hinged on his choices. This realization did not bring immediate peace, but it brought balance. It shifted the power back into my hands. Forgiveness, I learned, is not about restoring the past. It is about freeing the future from being defined by pain. I was no longer standing in the wound. I was standing beside it, observing it with clarity. And from that place, true healing became possible.
There comes a moment in deep emotional pain when suffering stops being chaotic and becomes deliberate. That moment arrived quietly for me, without ceremony or certainty. It was not a sudden wave of forgiveness or a dramatic realization. It was simply the understanding that I could no longer remain suspended between resentment and hope. I had to choose a direction, even if the path ahead remained unclear. Forgiveness began to shape not as an emotional release, but as an intentional act. I did not wake up one day feeling healed. I woke up tired of carrying anger like armor. It had protected me when I was most vulnerable, but now it was preventing me from moving forward. I understood that staying emotionally guarded might keep me safe, but it would also keep me alone. I looked at the life we had built with a new lens. It was imperfect, damaged, altered by betrayal, yet it was also real. Years of shared experiences could not be erased by one act, no matter how painful. I recognized that love does not disappear instantly. It fractures, it changes shape, but sometimes it survives in ways that are quieter and more resilient than passion. Choosing to stay was not a surrender. It was a boundary-filled decision grounded in clarity rather than fear. I made peace with the fact that forgiveness did not guarantee trust, and trust would need to be rebuilt slowly, intentionally, and without illusion. I was no longer willing to sacrifice my self-respect for stability. Any reconciliation would require honesty, accountability, and emotional presence I never demanded before. I felt grief for the version of marriage I had believed in. That marriage was gone. In its place stood something unfamiliar, fragile, and untested. Accepting that loss was essential. I could not rebuild on denial. I had to grieve what had ended in order to make room for what might begin. There were moments of doubt, moments when pain resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by memory or silence. Healing is not linear, and forgiveness does not erase consequences. I allowed myself to feel those setbacks without interpreting them as failure. Each wave of discomfort became an opportunity to reinforce my boundaries rather than retreat from them. I also discovered a new relationship with myself. I stopped viewing my age as a limitation and began to see it as context. I carried wisdom earned through experience. I understood my needs more clearly. I no longer feared solitude because I had learned that being alone did not mean being abandoned. It meant being present with myself. As I stood fully in my decision, I noticed a shift within me. My voice became steadier, my thoughts clearer. I no longer questioned my worth based on someone else's actions.
Forgiveness, I realized, had given me back my agency. It allowed me to choose connection without self-betrayal. Staying did not mean forgetting. It meant remembering everything and still choosing growth. It meant replacing silence with truth, habit with intention, and fear with responsibility. The relationship ahead would demand more from both of us than the relationship behind us ever had. I was no longer motivated by the desire to preserve the past. I was motivated by the possibility of creating something honest. Whether that future would last forever no longer mattered as much as whether it would be real. For the first time, I felt grounded, not because everything was resolved, but because I was aligned with myself. I had chosen forgiveness not as an obligation, but as a form of strength. And in that strength, I found a sense of peace I had not known before. The decision to stay was not the end of my healing. It was the beginning of a different kind of life.
Healing did not arrive as a dramatic transformation. It arrived slowly, almost invisibly, through consistency rather than emotion. Days passed without sharp pain. Weeks passed without obsessive thoughts. And somewhere along the way, I realized that I was no longer measuring time by the moment of betrayal. Life had begun to move forward without asking my permission, and I had chosen to walk with it rather than resist. Forgiveness matured into something stable. It was no longer fragile or conditional. It existed alongside memory, not in spite of it. I did not forget what had happened, but it no longer defined my emotional landscape. The wound had closed, leaving a scar that reminded me not of weakness, but of survival. Trust returned in fragments, carefully and intentionally, not as blind faith, but as earned presence. I learned that trust rebuilt after betrayal is quieter, more deliberate, and far more honest than the kind that exists before loss. It does not rely on assumptions, it relies on awareness, and in that awareness, I felt safer than I ever had before. Our relationship transformed into something unfamiliar yet grounding. It no longer revolved around roles or expectations. It revolved around choice. Each day became an act of intention rather than obligation. Love stopped being something I gave automatically and became something I offered consciously without sacrificing myself. I noticed changes within myself that extended beyond the marriage. I became more present in my own life, more attentive to my needs, more comfortable with silence. I stopped seeking validation in endurance and started valuing emotional honesty. Strength, I learned, is not the ability to withstand pain indefinitely. It is the ability to heal without losing yourself. I no longer feared my age. 35 had once felt like a threshold beyond which options narrowed and compromises multiplied. Now it felt like solid ground. I carried clarity, boundaries, and self-respect that younger versions of me had not yet learned. Life did not feel smaller, it felt more precise. Peace entered my life quietly, not as constant happiness, but as emotional stability, the kind of peace that allows you to breathe fully, that allows laughter to return without guilt, that allows joy to exist without suspicion. I found happiness not in perfection, but in authenticity. The happy ending I once imagined looked different now. It was not defined by romance alone or the absence of pain. It was defined by mutual effort, emotional presence, and the freedom to be myself fully. Happiness was no longer something I waited for, it was something I participated in. Forgiveness did not erase the past, it reshaped the future. It allowed love to exist without illusion and connection to grow without fear. And most importantly, it allowed me to reclaim ownership of my life, my choices, and my worth. I understood then that betrayal had not destroyed me. It had stripped away what was fragile and revealed what was real.
It had forced me to confront myself, to choose myself, and ultimately to love without disappearing. My story did not end with perfection. It ended with truth, with peace, with a quiet happiness rooted not in what I had preserved, but in what I had rebuilt, and that, I finally understood, was enough.